My name's Mark Spofforth. I'm a partner in Kreston Reeves, but I've been involved with the charity sector now for quite a long time. I'm a chartered accountant, obviously by profession, but I'm also past president of the Institute of Chartered Accountants, and I currently sit on the SORT committee where we're designing the rules for charities about what goes in the annual reports and trying to tell the FRC, the overarching regulator, that the language that we need to talk about from charities talking to donors and to other stakeholders is different to the language that we need to use when companies are talking to their shareholders or to other investors. So we're trying to simplify, we're trying to get that report a little more punchy and a little more direct. I am a trustee. I'm a trustee at the moment of the Thalidomide Trust, which is a very large amount of money, and also the Sussex Community Foundation, because I work down in Sussex. But I had the privilege a couple of years ago of being the High Sheriff down in West Sussex, and that year I spent more time going to see small charities and small voluntary groups working in the county than I'd ever done before. In fact, I learned more about how the county works in that 1 year than the other 60 years I've been living there. But the point was that I met lots of small voluntary groups where the finances, frankly, don't reflect the output and the volunteer time and effort that comes out of the charitable sector. So I'm absolutely passionate about the way the charitable sector works. But what I do think is that at the moment we have quite a problem in getting succession in terms of new trustees. It's becoming more and more difficult to find these people, partly, and I say this with Mike Ashley in the room, partly because the Charity Commission have done a really good job of giving lots of guidance. But the trouble is, the more guidance you give, the more people interpret that as being rules that they have to abide by, and the more it frightens them off, frankly. And what I'm trying to do today is hopefully to give you a way of dealing with risk and risk management which is practical and applied to even the smallest charities. 90% of the charities in this country have an income of less than 250,000. Now, everything seems to be looking at Oxfam and the really big charities, and they're very important because the vast majority of the income goes into those very big charities. But in terms of number of trustees, in terms of number of entities, they're very much more at the smaller end of the sector. So I do understand why it's difficult. I do understand why we worry as trustees. We're there to worry to a large extent. We worry about the risks and the issues that there might be, and we worry about things we don't know. I think we worry often more about what we don't know than what we do know, and we can look up for guidance. I'm very aware that we've got a number of livery companies in the room this afternoon, and a couple of the examples I use will be directed actually at the livery companies. I am a past master of 2 livery companies and currently chair one of those charities, and have only just started doing that. So I'm looking at the risk management in my own charity that I'm a chair of for the first time. So I'm going to hand on some of the lessons that I've learned there. And of course, one of the things that the Charity Commission do really well is to produce documents like this, which is the essential trustee. Tries to simplify what it is a trustee has to do. And one of those 6 parts of the jigsaw is managing your charity's resources responsibly. And that's what risk management is all about. It's managing your resources responsibly and looking after them. And if you don't know, they have also produced a new document for welcoming new trustees. So anybody, when you're bringing a new trustee on, you have an induction process. I think that's a really good, easy to read document which signposts you to other areas that you might want to look at. These are really good documents that are in there, but please just interpret them as being the guidance that you need rather than necessarily rules that you have to rule by. And one of the things that worries me at the moment is that the general regard in which charities are held at the moment, because we all know that the front pages have been full of Olive Cook, Kids Company, Oxfam. Seems to go on, doesn't it? And let me tell you that the BBC Panorama programme has a framework of a programme already set up, ready to go the next time there's a charity problem. So they've done some bits of filming, they've got the framework all there, And they're just going to fill in the bits with the exact example the next time it happens. And it will happen again. I mean, there's no doubt about it. There will be something that comes up. And that frightens us all. We don't want to be on the front page of the Daily Mail, do we? So the essential duties that you have to follow are those ones that are up there, about managing risk, protecting the assets, protecting your reputation, and protecting your people, and having and following appropriate controls. Now that all sounds like motherhood and apple pie a little bit, but the fact is that you've got to be bearing these things in mind in every meeting that you go to. And the question is, if you get together as a bunch of trustees, what is it that worries you? What keeps you awake at night? And I think one of the most useful things you can do as a group of trustees is to get together away from a normal quarterly or monthly meeting, somewhere completely different, probably over a glass of wine, and just talk about what it is that keeps you awake at night, what it is that worries you about your particular charity. Because it will all be different. Everybody will have different issues, everybody has different risk thresholds, but that process of having a discussion is really, really useful. And I think the loss of trust in charities generally is obviously very important, and we might hear a bit more about that a bit later on. The second bullet point I've got here is about the withdrawal of tax reliefs. It worried me slightly that on the 6th of June I read an article that says that Nick Montague, who used to be the chair of HMRC, is now chairing a group to look at reforming charitable tax reliefs. And it says that the recent media coverage of shocking behaviour in a few big charities highlights important wider questions about charities in society. And it asks a big question: should any public money at all go to charities except where they directly provide services? Now you might think that that's a fairly obvious answer to that, but I'm afraid that Nick Montague goes on to say that, after all, however criticised, central and local government administration is often superior in that for charities, and certainly more accountable. Well, I don't believe that. I don't agree with that. I think local authorities are very often far worse than you running your charities and me running my charities. And so I worry that they're coming at it from a very critical perspective. So be careful about that. What would happen if tax reliefs were withdrawn? What would happen to your charity if gift aid stopped being added to your income? You've got to set up a system that will help you to be sustainable and to continue if these things happen. We've had lots of issues about safeguarding coming up recently after the Oxfam things, and that's a fairly broad subject, but you really do have to be very aware wherever you've got beneficiaries or your staff involved that you're looking after them well. I find that the biggest issue that with the very small companies, very small charities, seems to be cybercrime and online banking. Really worried about money going adrift on the online banking, which in some respects I find surprising, but it clearly is a big issue, and it's in there in the papers every day, and there's the ability to lose a lot of money through that. And finally, succession. I think that's a big issue for most of us. Interestingly, I find that there are quite a lot of older trustees who were brought up as in a sort of society where it was just expected that you would be involved with volunteer groups. And there's the younger generation who are clearly going for a much better work-life balance and want to get involved as well. Just seems to be that middle-aged group in the middle where both parents have been working, they're probably time poor but more cash rich. They seem to have fallen out of the habit of giving time and input, and I think we need to work harder on that. And certainly down at the bottom end, I think every charity now needs to be much more aware of social media and how that impacts and how IT impacts. And the younger generation can really help with that and work it forward and be very useful in any board. So we need to define what the risk is. Risk is anything that could prevent your charity achieving its aims or carrying out its strategies. So anything that worries you, anything that would stop your charity from doing what it's doing in 5 years' time. Those are the things that you need to look at. What you need to do is to find a way of writing this down and categorising it and putting in a box that you all understand and can discuss and that you can deal with, instead of it whirring around and round in your brain, worrying about it, coming back to it again 3 months later. So what we're going to try and do this afternoon is to find a way of putting together a framework that will help. So you need to establish a policy which basically says we've got a problem here and these are the things that we're going to deal with. You've got to identify each of those individual risks. Anything that worries you, write it down. You're going to assess those risks, and I'm going to give you in a moment a mechanism for assessing it and prioritising the approach to risks. And then you're going to work out what you're going to do about it. Sometimes it may be that you're going to do nothing about it. I look after a local village hall, and we had a meeting of trustees, and one of the trustees did not want us to let the village hall out to a local band, local pop group, because they were going to smash the place up, they were too noisy, and it wasn't the sort of thing that they wanted. And we had to explain to her that actually that's exactly what we're there for. And yes, things will go wrong, but the answer is not to say that's so big a risk that we're just not going to do it. What we're going to do is we're going to take out proper insurance, and we're going to make sure there's a set of rules, and we're going to make sure that as far as possible we are in control of that particular letting. But you can see that amongst any group of trustees there will be very different attitudes to what you should do and what controls you should put in place, and that's what you're going to try and do as a group. Then you're going to come back regularly and have a look at it, because things change. Things change. Safeguarding is a great example. We did not have safeguarding on our risk matrix at the Thalidomide Trust at all until we started doing home visits, and we realised there were quite a lot of issues there which needed to be brought up, and actually it's gone successively further up the risk matrix. So you do need to realise that things change and your attitudes change and people change. So I put that slide up. It's there in your papers really so that when you go away and have your blue sky thinking day, you might want to use that as a way of starting your discussion. Let me give you a few more examples. I promised that I was not going to mention GDPR this afternoon. I've had enough of it. But actually, it is quite interesting because there have been a couple of instances recently. The University of Greenwich has just been fined £120,000 for letting data go outside. And also there is another charity called the British, let me get it right, otherwise I think, the British and Foreign Bible Society, that's been fined £100,000 simply because criminals managed to get access to their list of donors through their website because they hadn't put the right controls in place, and all that data went out. And the Information Commissioner has fined them £100,000. Now, I know that the Information Commission has said that they're going to be reasonable about fines, and I don't know what this particular charity's income or assets are. But you do need to be well aware that it is the hot topic at the moment. People are really worried about losing private data, quite rightly. So you need to be taking it on board as a risk and dealing with it. Being held to ransom. This was an American example of a charity called the Little Red Door. Received a very unpleasant email one morning explaining that somebody had hacked their systems and locked up all of their files, their financial data, donor data, everything, and they were not going to be able to work unless 50,000 bitcoins were paid to the hacker. They had to pay up in the end, and that's £30,000 they had to pay up in order to be able to continue doing what they were doing. Now, you might think that charities are not being targeted by these criminals because they would go after much bigger corporations. If you're able to do it, why wouldn't you go for the biggest fish to try and fund you? But they don't. They don't think like that, and you are as much a target as a bigger company. You can look up, the Ecclesiastical Insurance did a list of the top 10 risks. They did a survey amongst lots of smaller charities. Their top 10, I won't go through it all, but their top 10 list included, at the very top, funding and security of funding. Real issue today with local authority funding. If any of you have had money from authorities and local authorities, that's drying up or has dried up. And the problem with that, and very stark example we had of that down in Sussex was that a very small local charity that only took £3,000 a year from the county council suddenly didn't get its money. And they had decided, the county council, about 9 months prior to the beginning of the new financial year, that they would not be continuing to support the charity, but nobody told them. And it wasn't until 2 or 3 months after the end of the financial year they realised they weren't going to get this money. Now, they managed to react and they managed to get it elsewhere, but they hadn't planned for it. They hadn't done the risk analysis. They hadn't thought, what do we do if the local authority just don't write the cheque? And that's what you're trying to do. You're trying to sit down and, as far as possible, work out what you would do in certain circumstances. Now, the Charity Commission do have a requirement that you should report on your risk management policy, and certainly if you're a large charity with income of over £500,000 or a large amount of assets, you must put a report in your annual report. And I think actually it's a very good thing to do anyway. Whether you're large or small, I think it adds to the confidence of the reader when they go through your report and they understand that you have focused on this issue and you have dealt with this issue in a way that you think is appropriate. So company charities must do this as well, but small non-corporate charities don't have to, but I would think it's a very sensible thing to do. And what you're supposed to put in that report is that number one bullet point, which is the most important, is just to acknowledge that it's your responsibility to deal with it. So focus on it. It's not something that's slipped past, it's something that you're very much in control of and you've taken the responsibility for it. You also put in an overview about the process that you've got, and I'll come on to a way you might do that, and an indication that the major risks that you've come up with and decided upon have been assessed and you've put in place some processes for dealing with it. Now, the Charity Commission guidance on this is in a document called CC26, available on the website, and it's good to read certainly for chairs of charities, I think. And it basically breaks down the risks into a number of different categories. And the first one are governance risks. That's about whether you can find sufficient trustees to continue on, whether you've got the right skills in place. Have you got somebody who knows about social media? Have you got somebody who knows about IT controls? It talks about conflicts of interest. How do you deal with potential conflicts of interest? And a lot of the inquiries that you will read about that the Charity Commission do actually relate to conflicts of interest and people identifying them. So I think that's a really, really important one. The second one is operational risks. In other words, have you got the right contracts in place if you're providing services? Have you got the right staff recruitment and training in place? Have you got the right security in place? Financial risks, fairly obvious, I think. The things that, are you looking after the money and your investments if you have them? External risks. Have you got a reputation that could be trashed by a story on the front page of the paper, and would that then lead you with less income coming in? So very important, I think, to categorise them in the first place. And then the other thing that I wanted to mention on this was also to think about devising a disaster recovery plan. If you've got an office hall and it went up in flames, have you got a disaster recovery plan in place so that you know what would happen pretty quickly thereafter? Very appropriate for me to be saying that. Our Horsham office burnt down a few years ago, Sunday at the weekend. Suddenly found we had no office, no computers, no nothing. We did have a process in place, and by Monday lunchtime we were up and people were working in other offices. Now, it wasn't perfect, there were lots of problems with it, but at least when people rang up to find out what was going on, we had a place for them to go to. And I think there are some pretty basic and simple things that you can do here. It does not have to be complicated. Don't think this is all over complex. So let me just explain to you a way of prioritising and dealing with these and documenting your risks once you've thought about them. I've used an example here of IT failure. Let's imagine that the computer system goes down tomorrow. What is the issue? How's it going to impact on you? And the first thing you're going to do is to work out how likely it is that that's going to happen. Now that will depend on how complex your IT systems are, whether you've got people around to be able to help, whether it's happened before or not. But you have to assess on a score of 1 to 5, I'm suggesting, how likely it is that this is going to happen. And you're going to do this for every single risk, okay, trustee, succession, whatever it is, every single risk, you're going to have a line, and you're going to start off by defining the risk and then explaining how likely it is to happen. You're then going to assess how severe the impact of that happening on the organisation is. Again, you score it from 1 to 5. Is it going to stop you from working, full stop? Or is it just going to be a case of we're going to have to get somebody in to help us sort it out? So 1 to 5, try and work out what the severity is. And then you simply multiply those two factors together to come up with an overall risk factor, a score of what the overall risk is as applied to this particular item. And you're then going to work out whether that risk level is high, medium or low. And I like to have a traffic light system, red, yellow, green, and I'll explain in a moment how we get to our red, yellow or green scoring. But in this case we have an overall risk of 12, and that's a high risk. And so then we're going to work out whose job it is to sort this out. Well, in our case, it's going to be the finance director. And what are they going to do? Well, the ideas that we came up with was we need to make sure the antivirus software is up to date. Remember the National Health Service? No? Operating systems weren't up to date, antivirus systems weren't up to date, caused chaos. So we're going to make sure we've got the latest operating system, we've got backup plans, and particularly we're going to train people about cybercrime. Because it's very easy to talk about hackers coming into the system, but anybody here in the City of London, particularly where they deal with the fraud, will tell you that the weakness is people. It's people who give away passwords, it's people who pick up the telephone, it's people who misinterpret emails that are coming in. It's not usually a computer techie who does it. And then we're going to have the extra mitigation. We thought we would set up a plan where somebody would try and make our system fall over and would test it. So you do this with each of them, and as I say, I quite like to have a red, yellow and green traffic light system. So where the likelihood up here is scored 1 to 5, remote to highly likely, and the impact you've scored is insignificant up to extreme at 5, when you've multiplied those two together, if you come to a score that's less than 5, then probably that's not very important to deal with. Important to write it down so that you will think about it, but not important to immediately rush out and deal with it. At the other end of the scale, if you've got a score of over 12, you're in this sector, then you probably want to bring that up to front and centre of your board meetings to think about what needs to be done. And every quarter we come back and we look at those and we work out whether things are going to move between being red or green, and we deal with them. So that's relatively simple, I think you'll agree. It's relatively easy to do, and it comes out of a debate amongst a lot of people, so you've got lots of ideas coming up. But then the point is, once you've done that and you've written it down, then you've got a document to go back to think about these issues and to make sure you don't have to keep thinking about it anew. Some of the people out there's the Institute of Risk Management, there's a lot of people where you can make this much more complex. You can actually put numbers on the risk value, numbers on the cost of mitigation, and work out what your residual risk is in terms of pound notes. I think for the vast majority of charities that's overkill. If you like this stuff and you want to read it, by all means don't let me stop you. But actually, you know, people who really get into this stuff really get, I think, a bit over complex, and that's not the value that you get out of the operation. Now, I promised I'd come back to talk about livery companies a bit, because I think this is particularly interesting, seeing as where we're sitting, standing, and also it's very appropriate for me in trying to look at this from my own livery charity's point of view. I think that a lot of livery companies have an issue about induction. My livery company, I'm in two, it's quite senior people who come in and get appointed to charities, so it's very often a past master, somebody who's been around a long time, And they're quite difficult to challenge because they've seen it all, haven't they? Why would you worry about that? Well, actually, many of them haven't been involved with charities at all, and many of them don't actually focus on the right things. They may not have the right skills. So just be a little bit careful about that and make sure that there is an induction process. This is not an appointment by somebody where they just come and sit in meetings. They've got to think about it. They've got to be engaged. They've got to understand the skills and the training that are needed. So I think that's something that we need to look at. Succession is a real issue. At least we have a pool of people to trawl from. At least we can go and find people who have got the right skills. But if you're running a charity outside, that's very much more difficult. How do you find people? It's not as easy as putting an advert in the newspaper. It's very often on personal recommendation or previous beneficiaries perhaps, or anybody who's been interested. How likely is it you're going to be able to get those new people coming in? What age are they going to be? Formalisation of policies. We have no risk policy, we had no grant-making policy, we had no policies written out at all in my livery charity. Now, all right, it's not very big, we don't have large sums of money to give away, but at least somebody should have written down those considerations. So every time we were coming up to think about who to give grants to, we were kind of reinventing the wheel, so we weren't being very efficient. And I think that because we've been around for an awful long time and it's the way it's always been done, it's quite difficult to then trigger this idea of sitting down and starting to write down policies. GDPR, I promised I wasn't going to mention it. It's twice this afternoon I mentioned it. GDPR I'm worried about because we have two sets of data. We have the livery company membership data and we have our donor data. Do we register both? Well, we have actually. We've registered our charity just to be careful, just to be sure about it. I'm not sure we need to. We've got the same data controller, the same people are actually giving their permission, but you are separate entities. So think about GDPR. And talking about this separation of charity from company, there's a really good bit of research, and I'm not sure whether they've actually finalised the paper yet, but the Charities Commission has got guidance on charities connected to non-charitable organisations. Now that's pretty much every livery company there is one of those. And it's well worth, I think, looking at the principles that they're looking at. Do you make independent decisions? Are you influenced by the company when you're making a charitable decision? Are the boundaries between the two blurred? In which case, have you thought about how you make decisions? Are you completely open and accountable in your livery charity, or do you just report into the court? Do all the members know what's going on? Can you identify if the risks have changed between company and the charity, if there's a new relationship that pops up? What happens if the company is doing a fundraising activity to fund money into the charity? Whose responsibility is it to deal with the data and the controls? And at what point does that shift? Is it simply a donation to the charity, nothing to do with the charity? Or is it really the charity doing the fundraising under a different guise? And then it talks about having written agreements about things like sharing property and people. I think you could do overkill on that. I think it's just a case of thinking about the separation and making sure that everybody understands you've got two separate entities. But it's well worth reading, a really, really important document, I think. And there are also some new rules come out on the disqualification of trustees. Now, I hope actually that these deal with people who've been bankrupt and are not discharged from various criminal activities. I hope there aren't any of those in my livery company. But the point is there's a new form that everybody has to sign to make sure they're compliant. So one of the risks you might have is, are you complying with all of the regulations? Well, I'm just warning you that there's a new form that we hadn't done anything with. So download the form and get everybody to sign that anew. I talked about the Institute of Risk Management and how their documentation is slightly over-complex, but in their report, I think there are some really important points. They talk about the benefit of doing this exercise. It's really not the end product which is the valuable part, although that is valuable. The really valuable thing is getting down talking about it, identifying the risk, and deciding what you're going to do about it. It's not that you have to produce a piece of paper at the end of the day. That's not what this is about. It's about the process, and it should be transparent, and you should try and get everybody involved if you can. And they also talk about the value that once you've done that, you find that the board and the trustees have a much clearer and more consistent view of whether to take risks or not. You know, should you borrow money to fund a particular thing in your charity? And I don't, in my charities, I don't have any that actually has borrowed money, but I know places where it has happened, to do particular things now and to fund it over a period of time. Well, some people like that, some people don't. So the case, once you've done this exercise, you should find it much easier for people to come to a conclusion with which everybody is happy. Now I'm going to come to a close now, but in the slides, just do think about this fraud and cybercrime. I know it's something that a number of people are very worried about. You really do have to be very careful about fraud, because a lot of people think they're involved in charities, everybody's altruistic, and therefore fraud won't happen. I'm afraid it does, and it happens regularly, and people will take advantage of you. I love all these different words, which I put definitions in for vishing, smishing, phishing, all sorts of things going on. It's basically different ways of the same thing, trying to get hold of information. So, don't think of this as a bureaucratic exercise. Do take the time to think about it. And I think the best way is to get away for an away day. Talk to other people. I mean, at events like this, do talk to other people about what risks they've identified, because the most important part of this is to identify various things. And I think once you've done this exercise, it's a really good marketing tool to donors to say you've thought about it. When they give you money, the risk to them of that money not being used in the way that you expect has diminished. So you're able to tell them a story about why you've thought about why and how the money that you're going to take from them is going to be spent in the way that they expect. So thank you very much.